We walked into that therapy office hoping to save our marriage. He sat there, calm and professional, the expert who was supposed to help us navigate the wreckage, the one who could maybe guide us back to each other. He was supposed to be neutral, safe, but somewhere between the tearful confessions and the fragile attempts at understanding, I crossed an unforgivable line. I didn't just fail to save my marriage in that room. I destroyed it in a way I never thought possible, because I fell for him. Our therapist, my name is Chloe. Before Dr. Evans, before the therapy sessions that were meant to be our lifeline, my marriage to Ben was already gasping for air. We'd been together for 12 years, but somewhere along the way, we lost each other. Years of small arguments that grew into big ones. Years of misunderstandings that built walls of resentment. Years of hurts left unspoken. They had chipped away at us until there was almost nothing left but bitterness and silence. We lived in the same house, but it didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a cold, tense waiting room. We'd argue constantly about stupid things, the fights escalating quickly into harsh words we couldn't take back. Or even worse sometimes was the silence. Days would go by where we barely spoke, just coexisting like strangers, politeness stretched thin over a deep well of unhappiness. I felt so desperately lonely. How can you feel so alone when you share your life, your bed, with someone? But I did. I felt invisible, unheard, unloved, like I was screaming into a void, and Ben either couldn't hear me or chose not to. He wasn't a monster, but he was absent, emotionally checked out. He retreated into work, into his phone, into anything but us. He always said he felt criticized, like he could never do anything right, so he just stopped trying. We were trapped in this miserable cycle, pushing each other further and further away. Therapy wasn't my first idea, but it felt like the last one. I'd read articles online, seen friends go through it. I brought it up to Ben cautiously at first, then pleaded, then maybe even gave an ultimatum, therapy, or we seriously consider separating. It felt like the only chance we had left. He was reluctant, of course. He didn't believe in talking about feelings with a stranger, thought it was a waste of money. But maybe he saw the desperation in my eyes, or maybe he was just tired of fighting. He finally grudgingly agreed. Walking into Dr. Evans's office for that first session, my hands were shaking. I felt sick with nerves, embarrassed that we'd let things get this bad, terrified of digging into the pain. But underneath the fear, there was this tiny, fragile flicker of hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the turning point. Maybe this calm, professional man sitting across from us held the key to fixing what we had broken. Maybe he could fix us. Dr. Evans seemed at first like everything we desperately needed. His office was calm, quiet, a world away from the constant tension that filled our house. He had a kind face, listened intently, and spoke in this measured, soothing voice. He projected an air of quiet confidence, like he'd seen it all and knew exactly how to navigate the mess Ben and I had made of our marriage. It felt like finally stepping into a safe harbor after being tossed around in a storm for years. In those first few sessions, sitting on that couch across from him, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Heard. When I spoke about my loneliness, my frustrations, the hurt Ben inflicted, often unintentionally I know, but hurt nonetheless, Dr. Evans didn't interrupt or get defensive. He nodded. He asked thoughtful questions that made me feel like my feelings were valid, like I wasn't crazy for feeling the way I did. He had this incredible ability to reflect my own jumbled thoughts back to me in a way that made perfect sense. It was incredibly validating. Ben, on the other hand, hated it. He'd sit stiffly beside me, arms crossed, looking guarded and uncomfortable. He often said afterwards that he felt ganged up on, like Dr. Evans always took my side. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But Ben's discomfort only seemed to highlight how much Dr. Evans did seem to understand me. It created this subtle dynamic where I felt like Dr. Evans and I were on one team, trying to figure out Ben on the other. And slowly, without me even fully realizing it at first, something began to shift inside me. I started counting down the days until our next therapy appointment. I told myself it was because I was committed to fixing the marriage. But if I'm being honest, a big part of it was anticipating the hour I'd spend in Dr. Evans's presence, his attention, his validation. It became addictive. It was like a drug filling the gaping emotional void that Ben had left unattended for so long. I started putting more effort into my appearance on therapy days, choosing my outfit more carefully, putting on makeup when I usually wouldn't bother. Small things, but they were signs. I found myself thinking about him during the week, replaying conversations from our sessions, wondering what he thought about something I'd said, imagining his reaction. It felt like having a secret crush, which seemed harmless, even a little silly given the circumstances. Looking back now, the professional boundaries started blurring almost imperceptibly. A session might run 5 or 10 minutes over schedule because Dr. Evans and I were deep in a conversation he didn't want to cut short. Sometimes he'd share a very brief, carefully chosen personal story, something seemingly harmless about his own life that made him feel less like a blank slate therapist and more like a real person, relatable and human. Then he suggested adding occasional individual check-in sessions for both Ben and me, separate from the couple's work. His reasoning sounded professional enough to explore personal perspectives more deeply without the pressure of the partner present. It made sense on paper, but what it actually did was create a private channel between just him and me, a space where my connection to him could grow away from Ben's presence. Of course, a little voice in the back of my head sometimes whispered that this felt off, that my feelings were maybe getting too intense. But I pushed it down. I rationalized everything. It's just transference, I told myself, latching on to the clinical term I'd heard somewhere. It's perfectly normal to develop strong feelings for your therapist, especially when you feel so misunderstood everywhere else. I convinced myself it was just part of the process, a sign that the therapy was working because I felt safe enough to be vulnerable. I ignored the flutter in my stomach when he smiled warmly, the way my heart seemed to beat a little faster when our eyes met. I told myself it meant nothing. It was just therapy. It was safe. As the weeks went on, the couple's sessions felt less like healing and more like picking at scabs. Ben and I seemed stuck, circling the same arguments, the same resentments. He remained defensive, shut down, while I felt increasingly desperate and unheard. The hope I'd initially felt started to wither, replaced by a growing sense of despair about our future. If anything, the therapy highlighted just how far apart we truly were. Naturally, I leaned even more heavily on Dr. Evans during my individual check-ins. He became the only person I felt could truly understand the depth of my unhappiness. I cried often in those sessions, pouring out my fears and frustrations, feeling raw and exposed. He was always so calm, so validating. He'd praise my efforts, my insights into the relationship, my strength in enduring the situation. He made me feel seen, intelligent, special, all the things I hadn't felt from Ben in years. The professional line, which I'd tried so hard to convince myself was still firmly in place, started to feel incredibly thin, almost imaginary. My emotional reliance on him grew stronger with each passing week. Then came the session that changed everything. It was a couples session, and it was brutal. Ben and I got into one of the worst arguments we'd ever had, right there on Dr. Evans' couch. Accusations flew, old wounds were ripped open, and the air crackled with hostility. Ben reached his breaking point first. He stood up abruptly, declared the therapy wasn't working, and he was done, and just walked out, slamming the office door behind him. I just sat there, stunned, then completely broke down. Sobs racked my body. This was it. It was really over. All the fragile hope I'd clung to shattered in that moment. I felt utterly alone, abandoned not just by Ben, but by the possibility of fixing our life together. Dr. Evans let me cry for a few minutes. Then he spoke softly, offering words of comfort, validating how painful this must be. He moved from his usual chair across the room. Maybe he pulled another chair closer, or maybe he knelt down beside the couch where I was huddled. He offered me tissues, his voice gentle, reassuring. He was doing his job, I suppose, comforting a distraught client. But then, something shifted. The air changed. Maybe he placed a hand on my shoulder to steady me, and I instinctively leaned into the touch, starved for any kind of comfort. Maybe I looked up at him, my eyes filled with tears, searching his face for something. Reassurance? Sympathy? I don't know. But our eyes met and held, for just a fraction too long. The professional distance, the safe boundary that was supposed to protect us both, simply dissolved in that charged silence. I don't even know who moved first. Did he lean in? Did I tilt my head up? It all happened so fast, yet felt like slow motion. His lips touched mine. It wasn't a passionate movie-style kiss. It was hesitant, awkward, messy, probably fueled more by my desperate vulnerability and his lapse in judgment than any real romance. But it happened. He kissed me, my therapist, the man who held all my secrets, my fears, my fragile hopes for my marriage, kissed me in the very room where those hopes had just died. We pulled apart almost instantly, shock registering on both our faces. The air crackled, not with connection, but with the enormity of what had just occurred. The trust, the ethics, the entire framework of the therapeutic relationship, it all shattered in that single, catastrophic moment. All that was left was a sickening wave of guilt, confusion, and a terrifying, forbidden awareness that an unthinkable line had just been crossed. The moment our lips parted, the reality of what we'd done crashed down hard. We both pulled back instantly. It's like being electrocuted. Shock registered clearly on Dr. Evans's face, mirroring my own horror. The air in the room, moments before charged with a strange intimacy, now felt thick with shame and panic. He scrambled back, physically putting distance between us, running a hand through his hair. "Chloe, I am so sorry," he stammered, his usual calm composure completely gone. "That was incredibly unprofessional, inappropriate. It shouldn't have happened. I got caught up." He trailed off, unable to meet my eyes. I couldn't speak. My mind was racing, trying to process the whiplash of emotions, the lingering comfort from his attention moments before, now consumed by a tidal wave of guilt, confusion, and a terrifying realization of the gravity of the situation. How could we possibly go back? How could I sit on this couch again? How could I face Ben, knowing this? The session ended abruptly, wrapped in a suffocating blanket of awkwardness. He mumbled something about needing to maintain professional boundaries, about perhaps needing to refer us elsewhere, but nothing felt concrete. I practically fled the office, my heart pounding, my cheeks burning. Did it stop there? God, I wish I could say it did. That the shock and the wrongness of it all snapped us both back to reality. But it didn't. Not immediately. Maybe it was the intensity of the shared secret. Maybe it was the toxic allure of the forbidden. Maybe I was just so broken and desperate for any kind of connection. I don't know. A few days later, an email arrived from Dr. Evans, not from his professional account, but a personal one. "Just checking in," he said, seeing how I was doing after the difficult session. That email opened a door. Secret texts followed, cautious at first, then more frequent, more personal. We didn't meet outside the office initially, but the digital connection intensified. It felt like a dangerous game, hiding these messages, deleting call logs. He was still technically our therapist, though the actual therapy sessions became a farce. Sitting on that couch with Ben, trying to talk about our marriage while exchanging coded glances with Dr. Evans, felt like torture. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Dr. Evans was either overly stiff and clinical, or sometimes I'd catch a look, a flicker of something personal that sent my guilt spiraling. I felt like I was betraying Ben on multiple levels now, not just with the initial kiss, but with this ongoing secret communication, all happening under the guise of trying to fix our marriage. It was sick. How did it finally blow up? Ben wasn't stupid. He knew our therapy sessions weren't getting better. If anything, the tension at home felt worse. And he noticed a change in me. I was jumpier, more secretive with my phone, more withdrawn from him than ever. He started asking questions I couldn't easily answer. The final nail in the coffin came one evening when I left my phone unattended for just a few minutes. Ben picked it up, maybe to check the time, maybe out of suspicion, I'll never know. But a notification popped up, a text message, from a contact simply labeled E, Dr. Evans' initial. The message itself wasn't overly explicit, something like, "Thinking of you after today's session." Tough one. But it was enough. "Who's E?" Ben asked, his voice dangerously quiet, holding up the phone. My blood ran cold. I tried to stammer out an excuse, a friend, a colleague, but the look on my face, the sheer panic, must have given me away. He didn't need me to spell it out. He scrolled through a few more messages, his face growing paler and harder with each word he read. He knew. He might not have known about the kiss specifically at that moment, but he knew something inappropriate was going on. That night, under his relentless, heartbroken questioning, the whole sordid story came tumbling out. The growing connection, the kiss in the office, the secret messages. Ben's reaction was devastating. It wasn't just the infidelity. It was who it was with. The one person we had trusted to help us, the person who knew our deepest vulnerabilities, our marital struggles. He looked at me with utter disgust, like I was something vile he didn't even recognize. "You cheated on me," he said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and deep, profound hurt. "With the man we paid to fix us? How could you, Chloe? How could he?" The double betrayal seemed to break something deep inside him. The foundation wasn't just cracked anymore, it was utterly destroyed. Needless to say, that was the end. The end of any pretense of therapy, the end of any hope for reconciliation, the end of my marriage to Ben. The discovery, the confession, it detonated everything. There was no coming back from a betrayal like that, not for Ben. He looked at me with a mixture of disgust and heartbreak that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. The weeks and months that followed were a blur of pain and practicalities. We separated almost immediately. The divorce was as messy and agonizing as you might expect when such a profound breach of trust is involved. Lawyers, dividing assets, figuring out custody arrangements for the kids. It was all done through a fog of hurt, anger, and deep, deep regret. Our shared life was dismantled, piece by painful piece. And Dr. Evans? After the initial shock wore off and the full weight of the situation settled in, I knew I couldn't just let his actions slide. What he did wasn't just a mistake, it was a profound ethical violation. He took advantage of my vulnerability, of his position of power, in the very space that was supposed to be safe. Reporting him to the licensing board was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. It meant laying bare my own shame, my own role in what happened publicly. But it felt necessary. People in his position need to be held accountable. I don't know the final outcome of the investigation, but he is completely out of my life now, a ghost from a nightmare I wish I could forget. So, where am I now? I'm alone, living in a smaller place, trying to co-parent with Ben, which is strained at best. I'm trying to pick up the pieces of a life that feels completely shattered, a life I blew apart with my own choices. The guilt is a constant companion. It's not just the guilt of cheating on Ben, but the guilt of letting myself become so lost, so desperate for connection, that I fell into such a compromised and damaging situation. I carry the weight of my decisions, and I carry the weight of his ethical failure, too. I went into therapy looking for help, for healing, for a way to fix the broken parts of my life and my marriage. I was vulnerable, desperate, and looking for someone to understand me. Instead, I found myself entangled in something that caused even more destruction. I mistook professional empathy for personal interest, therapeutic validation for genuine affection. And he, the person trained to uphold boundaries, allowed them, maybe even encouraged them, to crumble. This whole devastating experience, it ripped away any illusions I had and taught me some critical, painful lessons. It showed me just how real vulnerability in therapy is, and how absolutely crucial it is that this vulnerability is protected by unwavering professional boundaries. You open up your deepest wounds in that room, and that trust cannot be violated. I learned that professional boundaries are not suggestions. They are essential safeguards, especially in relationships like therapy, where there's an inherent power imbalance. Crossing them isn't just inappropriate, it's deeply harmful and unethical. It taught me that external validation isn't a substitute for self-worth or fixing a broken relationship. Seeking approval or connection from someone outside, especially someone in a position of authority like a therapist, is a dangerous detour. It doesn't heal the core issues, it often creates bigger ones. I now see the importance of recognizing red flags, even subtle ones. Sessions running long consistently, overly personal disclosures from the therapist, physical contact that feels unnecessary, focusing more on you than the relationship you came to fix. These are warning signs that things are going off track, and ultimately, it underscored the need to address marital problems directly and honestly, or make the difficult decision to leave. Using therapy as a replacement for the intimacy missing in the marriage, rather than a tool to rebuild it or gain clarity, is a recipe for disaster. An honest conversation with Ben, however painful, or even an honest separation before things got so complicated, would have caused far less damage in the long run. Sometimes, the very place you turn to for healing can become the source of your deepest wounds, especially if boundaries aren't fiercely protected by everyone involved. Thank you for listening to my story. Please remember to share, like, and subscribe to this channel. Also, don't forget to turn on post notifications to be among the first to watch our videos. See you in the next video.